All right, lesson 10, things to come, or eschatology, last things. So the Bible always gives us a glimpse into the future. The Bible's always a future-looking book, as well as a present-looking book. So one of the things that was unique about Christianity and Judaism was that it had a forward-looking mindset. Even though, Judaism was cyclical, but it still was kind of going in circles in a forward direction, looking forward to the end of history. So history has an ultimate goal, has an end point, a climax where God breaks into the world. And so that kind of made Christianity and Judaism very, very unique amongst most of the religions and philosophies of the ancient world.
So other religions don't look forward to anything. It just stops whenever
It's just
time
cycles.
ends.
Yeah, it's just one cycle. You just cycling over and over and over again. I mean, look at Buddhism. Buddhism, what? Reincarnation, reincarnation. Though in Buddhism you do escape, um, Hinduism, Buddhism, you do escape that reincarnation cycle, but it's not like it's going towards a point. It's just you want to get out of it. So I guess maybe there's a individual um, ultimate goal of getting free. But as far as the universe, I think just keeps going on forever like that. Though I think in Hinduism, I think there is an ultimate absorption of everything back into the divine. Um, but as far as ancient history, I mean, it was pretty just just going through the motions over and over and over again, cycle after cycle after cycle. So most of the things are very cyclical, and life is just one big series of events after another, coming back and forth. So the circle of life, the great super spiritual deep philosophy of Disney, of Lion King, right? The circle of life. You're born, you live, you die. Someone else is born, they live, they die. And you just kind of keep going on in this circle of life. Um, Whereas Christianity says, no, God is going to break into history at the end of time. Something unique is going to happen. God's going to come in, he's going to restore all things, and there's going to be this eternal state. So what happens today is important because it affects the future. Helmut Thielicke, I don't know how to say this guy's name, says, when the drama of history is over, Jesus Christ will stand alone upon the stage. All the great figures of history, Pharaoh, Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, Churchill, Stalin, Johnson, Mao Zedong, will realize they have been bit actors in a drama produced by another. So we're all just little minor characters. God is the main character. God is the author and the main character in the play. The prophets of the Old Testament always spoke about the day of the Lord. And usually the day of the Lord was kind of negative. It was like God's going to break in and he's going to bring an end to all their sin and their rebellion. And so when God breaks into at the end of time, it's a time of judgment. It's a time of reckoning. It's a time of dealing with evil. And so the New Testament picks up on that as well. Jesus Christ, of course, birth and death is God breaking into history. But then there's also going to be a second coming of Christ at the end of time, when that will ultimately take place. So there is a time for resolution of evil, a glorious hope for Christians, a day of final judgment for unbelievers. But it's going to bring in a time of eternal security, eternal prosperity for God's people. All the nations are going to come and serve God. So the Old Testament is looking for that day of the Lord, that time when God comes in. And it's also tied up in all of the prophecies of the Messiah, who's going to come and rule the world in righteousness, but also to suffer. And so the Old Testament is kind of ambiguous. This messianic figure is a suffering figure who's going to pay for the sins of the world, but also a king who's going to make everything right and bring justice. So, Inky, how does the New Testament resolve that tension that's there in the Old Testament about this messianic figure?
So are you referring to like what Isaiah would say?
Well, you tell me.
Yeah, because
What does Isaiah say?
so Isaiah gives specific like 15 different details, really specific about
Uh-huh.
the death of the suffering servant, which is
Right.
Jesus. And he says the suffering, rejection by his people, silence before his accuser, taking our sins on himself, being treated unjustly, and buried with rich people, and his resurrection from the dead. These are all things that actually happened. And so Isaiah, being this prophet who never even saw Jesus,
Mhm.
being able to foresee what happens in the future is kind of like a amazing thing because even the people in the Old Testament are actually saying, "Oh, there's going to be someone who's going to come and rule over everybody."
So how does the New Testament resolve these two different pictures of the Messiah? Like you said, this suffering servant from Isaiah 53. Yet we also have this, the king coming and ruling over the world, ruling over the nations, bringing righteousness, judging the nations. How does the New Testament, Mrs. O, reconcile those two ideas?
Um, well, all the prophecies are fulfilled in the New Testament, just to, except only one thing, which is, Jesus will come again at the end.
So the New Testament has two comings of the Messiah.
Mhm.
So that was always like, how does this happen? How can even, when Jesus is talking about, I'm going to suffer and die and go back, and they say, well, how can that be? The Messiah is supposed to stay. How can you say that you've got to leave? And it's like, well, because there's two different comings. There's the first coming for the sin, to die for the sins of the world. There's a second coming then to bring judgment and reconciliation to the whole world. So the New Testament has these two comings of Christ. And so that really makes Christianity unique, where we have this already, but not yet. Already we have salvation, already we have eternal life, already we're forgiven, already we are saved, but not yet fully. Something is going to happen in the future that's going to bring the fullness of that salvation. And it's almost like a Jewish wedding, where a Jew, two people would get betrothed, be get engaged, and they would actually have a ceremony, yakon, right? Yakonchik, and exchange rings, exchange vows, and pledge themselves to be married, yet not come together to consummate that marriage, usually about a year later.
Huh.
And so that a year later, then the bridegroom would go and he would prepare the house, probably build an addition onto his father's house, furnish it, make enough money, prepare to support his wife. And then when he's ready, he'd bring all of his friends. He would come to the bride's house and parade her through the street and bring her to his house. And they would have like a week-long wedding festival. And then they would be married. So in that marriage, in that yakonchik, that betrothal, it was binding, yet they did not come together. That was not consummated. And that's kind of what Christ's first coming is, like a betrothal, right? And he gives us the Holy Spirit almost like as a ring, as a wedding ring, as a guarantee that he's going to come back and give us the fullness of salvation and bring us into his home. Jesus, I'm going away, but yet I'll come back. I'm going to go away and prepare a place for you. but I'm going to come back and bring you to be with me in my Father's house. You can be with me forever. And so the New Testament does have this eschatological aspect to it, where we're waiting for that second coming, the return of the bridegroom for that wedding, for that marriage, to unite himself with his people for eternity. But in the in-between times, we're in this already not yet tension. We're already married to Christ, but yet we're not experiencing the fullness of it. We're already forgiven and freed from sin, yet we still struggle with sin. Right? Satan has already been defeated, yet he still tries to trip us up until Christ comes and puts him into the lake of fire. So right now we have this period where we have to wait, we have to endure, we have to suffer persecution until Christ comes back again. So the final rule of God is going to be consummated in the future. When Christ comes back, sets up his kingdom, marries us, we get to live with him forever. And so that is what eschatology is all about. What does that look like? What does the Bible tell us about that time? And so we're going to take a look at various aspects of this second coming of Christ, the end of time, what happens, and what are the signs of that coming. So, Mrs. O, is Jesus coming back?
Yeah,
How do you know?
because the Bible says so.
Because Jesus said, I'm coming back, right?
Huh?
Yeah, Jesus himself, can you think of any verses where Jesus says, I am coming back?
Any specific verses?
You'd be thinking,
Yeah, he said to the disciples when he ascension to the heaven, I will be coming as you saw me coming to heaven.
okay, we'll talk about that. So the two angels said, as you saw him go up, he's going to return again. How about you,
Okay.
Inky? Can you think of a verse?
So, first,
What's that?
Matthew 24,
Okay. What does Matthew 24 say?
29 to 30. So immediately after the tribulation of the days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mount, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory.
So he said, I'm coming back. You're going to see the Son of Man coming back. And of course, I talk about John 14:3. I'm going away to prepare a place for you. And even Paul emphasized the fact that the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead will be, and Christ will be raised first, and we'll all be brought up to him to meet him in the air, and he will come down and to be us forever. And so this is kind of the hope that we have, and it's not just speculation. Oh, that's kind of nice. We're waiting for this, but it is supposed to be a motive and a spur us on to holy behavior. It says in 1 John 2:28, abide in him, because you know that when he comes back, you don't want to be ashamed. Right? You don't want to draw back in shame at his coming, but you want to be righteous as he is in righteous. And in John chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, we're children of God. We know that when he comes back, we will be like him because we'll see him as he is. Therefore, everyone who has this hope on him purifies himself just as he is pure. And even 1 Peter 3:11 talks about the fact, hey, if we know that this whole world's going to be destroyed and Christ is going to come back and renew all things, how should we live holy and righteous and godly lives in preparation for that? So Jesus even says, gets several parables saying, the master goes away and comes back to his servants, and the servants need to be ready, right? The servants have to be ready for the master to come back. So Jesus is coming back. And so that's a general fact. That's a general fact. Christ is coming back. But when does he come back? Are there any events that have to occur between now and Jesus coming back? Could Jesus come back tonight?
No, he mentions that there are signs of the times in the end of the age. Like there's going to be wars between nations, earthquakes coming, famines and troubles. He mentions kingdoms will be against kingdoms.
We
And
haven't
so
seen
he
that
meant
yet, have we? Have we seen any of that yet, Enki?
we've seen wars of nations versus nations. Like right now, Ukraine,
Oh, we
Russia,
got a couple of wars going on right now.
Israel.
Yeah, Israel and Gaza. Any earthquakes?
Yeah, Japan. There's been
I just saw there was a
earthquakes.
bunch of earthquakes. I think
California.
yeah, was it just a couple days ago? Or was it like 3, 4 days ago? California had one. Out in the mid, some of the islands out in the Pacific had an earthquake. Yeah, I'm getting reports of earthquakes like almost every week. So I mean, it's happening. There are earthquakes all over the place. Wars and rumors of wars, famines. I mean, all that stuff is happening. So you could say, well, all that stuff is happening. Christ could come back. Mrs. O, is there anything else that has to happen before Christ returns?
Jesus said, the gospel needs to be spread to the end of the earth.
Yeah, to every tribe, nation, tongue, language, and people.
Right.
Are we
Yes.
there yet?
I don't think,
Do you know how close we are?
I don't know.
Yeah, we're pretty close. I think it's almost, I still think there's like several thousand languages and people groups that do not have the Bible in their native tongue.
Hmm.
But it's almost close where I think almost everyone has access to the Bible, or at least parts of the Bible, in a language they can understand. So the gospel has been preached to almost every nation. So we're getting close to that. We're getting close to that. One of the things I like about Wycliffe Bible translators, that's one of their driving motives. Let's go out and translate the Bible in every language so we can make this happen, right? So they take that pretty literally, pretty seriously, and they are working hard at that. But there does seem to be, if you believe in the tribulation, right, it would seem like the tribulation has to happen before Jesus Christ can come back and set up his kingdom. So you mentioned Matthew 24, Inky, some of those events, but there's also going to be wars and rumors where there's things that are going to happen. Tribulation has never been seen before. Revelation talks about the tribulation, especially Revelation 7:14, about a great tribulation that will come upon the earth for 7 years. Some people link that to the 70th week of Daniel, when the Antichrist will set up his throne. And so it seems like the Antichrist has to be revealed. The spirit of the Antichrist is already here, though, but it looks like there has to be this figure, this end time figure, the man of lawlessness, the beast, who he needs to come and try to rule the world for 7 years before Christ comes back.
Yes. Walters, are we part of that 144,000 people?
Oh my gosh, you have to ask me hard questions, Inky.
Are we one of those?
I don't. Yeah, well, we should study the book of Revelation. There's a couple ways you can look at that. One would be those are 144,000 people that Jews who are converted in the tribulation. So those are a special group of people who are then missionaries and go out into the world and preach the gospel in those 7 years of the tribulation. So no, we would not be one of those. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, then no, I mean, out of the millions and millions and millions of Christians, yeah, I don't think I have a chance of being one of them. If it's symbolic, right? Is it symbolic of those who are pure and holy before God? In that number, 144,000 is 12 12 times 12, right? The 12 tribes of Israel times 12, 1200. Then that would be symbolic of the fullness of the church. And then, of course, yeah, then we would probably be considered of those 144,000. So take your pick, Inky. Are you a
That's very
dispensationalist, Inky?
selective.
Are you a
Huh?
dispensationalist?
Huh?
Are you a dispensationalist?
Uh,
Are you a covenant theologian? Well, see, that's why we have to have this next class so that we can talk about
man, that's very selective though. Only
yeah,
144,000.
yeah. Well, we'd have to look at the Book of Revelation, look at the context of that. But in the Book of Revelation, those are definitely talks about people who are go through the tribulation and are selected by God to preach the gospel under intense persecution. So that would be my understanding of who they are, and they seem to be Jews, or if you're an ultra dispensationalist, yeah, they would definitely be Jews who believe in Jesus. So we're now in this, when we start talking about the end times, there's multiple viewpoints on all of these issues. And so we're going to be talking about those different ways of looking at this. But the fact is, there is going to be some kind of tribulation where there is military, economic, political chaos, and there's going to be this antichrist, this beast, this man of lawlessness who comes, sets himself up as a world ruler, and tries to eliminate Christianity, eliminate belief in Jesus, eliminate belief in God, using economic, political, military pressure to have everyone take his mark and to worship him and to serve him and to obey him. And anyone who opposes them will be killed or severely persecuted. So that is kind of like the big event before Christ comes back in his second coming. But there's three views of this tribulation. So if you have your notes there on the bottom of page 2, we have pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and post-tribulation. So a pre-tribulation position would say there's two parts of Christ's second coming. The first part is a rapture where Christians are caught up to the heavens with Christ, and they escape the 7 years of tribulation, and then they come back after 7 years at the end of the tribulation, and Christ defeats Satan, Christ defeats
I like that view.
God, and sets up the millennium. You like that view?
Yeah, because we escape.
We escape it. The mid-tribulation period says, well, Christ comes and raptures the church halfway through, 3.5 years into the tribulation. So there's like 3.5 years where we're purified and we have to go through persecution. But before the really bad stuff happens, if you read the book of Revelation, Christ takes the church out, and then 3.5 years later, we come back and Christ sets up the eternal kingdom. Do you like that one, Inky?
3.5 years, quite a lot of time.
Well, how about a post-tribulation? Post means there is no rapture, right? The church goes through the 7 years of tribulation, and then Christ comes back, and pretty much everyone's killed off. Most Christians are probably killed off in the 7 years. Though there are a few that remain faithful, there are a few that escape and make it to the end. But the church then goes through this great tribulation, suffers intense persecution, massive martyrdom, where the beast tries to eliminate Christianity completely. Do you like that one, Inky?
No.
No. So my view has always been, yeah, pray for the pre-tribulation or rapture, but prepare for the post-tribulation. Because you may have to go through it, so be ready
So
for it.
who's right of the three?
Well, we'll
Are they
find
all-
out when it happens. We'll find out. I think the pre-tribulational and the mid-tribulational is a very recent position for about maybe only a couple hundred years. So late 1700s, dispensationalism was invented. I don't want to say invented, but and became very, very popular, especially in America and England. And so they pushed the pre-tribulational rapture. And of course, then there was a break, and then we said, oh no, it's going to be the mid-tribulation. But most of the church for 1800 years, 2000 years has been post-tribulational, anticipating the church going through the tribulation. And there are different types of post-tribulation as well, where they would say, well, we're going through the tribulation right now. So any kind of persecution, any kind of opposition to the gospel is, part of that. So there's wars, there's rumor of wars, there's persecution happening now. So that's tribulation. And Christ is going to come back at some point and set up the eternal kingdom. So there does seem to be, though, that there is this period of time where there's intense persecution, especially by this figure called the beast or the Antichrist. So is there yet anything to happen before the return? So those who hold to the pre-tribulational view say that there's nothing preventing from the rapture happening at any moment. So that was one of the big calling cries of dispensationalism, the anytime imminent return of Christ. Christ could come back today. Be ready, be ready. And that was like every Sunday the pastors would preach, be ready, Christ could come back tonight. Be ready, Christ could come back today. Not as strong today. I mean, when I was a kid, man, I heard that all the time. Did you hear that, Mrs. O? When you were growing up, were there a lot of push for, Christ is going to return. You need to live every day as if the Lord will return today. Those who hold to a mid-tribulation or post-tribulation view say, well, obviously, there's got to be some events that happened before. It's got to be a beast. There's got to be an Antichrist. There has to be this persecution before Christ will come back. So there's some debate about that. But you could make a case that, Christ could come back at any time. He could come back at any time. And especially in the parables, some of the parables, Jesus said, be ready. You never know when the master's going to return. So there is that imminence to Christ's return, and he's going to come back when you least expect him. So make sure that you're ready and you're found to be faithful, right? You're not caught unaware. You're not caught unprepared for your master to come back. Okay, so I think the dispensationalists are right in that respect, that you need to be ready. It could happen at any point. The millennium. Well, let's talk about the millennium. What is the millennium, Mrs. O?
Millennium is the 1,000-year reign of Christ at the end of history.
You know where the word millennium comes from?
No.
Well, 1,000 years is a millennium.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in the second millennium. Well, we're actually starting the third millennium since Christ. So there's been 2 millenniums since Christ. So mil means 1,000. Millimeter, right? Milligram. Yeah, so mil means 1,000. So 1,000 enniums years, so 1,000 years. Millennius. So 1,000 years. And so the millennium is a 1,000-year reign of Christ at the end of history. So Inky, where in the Bible does it talk about the millennium?
Revelation 20, 1 through 10.
Anywhere else?
That's it.
That's it. So it does kind of create a little bit of debate. Is this millennium literal? Does Christ come back and reign on earth for a literal 1,000 years? Now you'll have dispensationalists say yes. Dispensationalists make a very distinct separation between the church and Israel. And so the 1,000 years is when God fulfills all of the promises that he's made to Israel. So the Davidic king, Jesus, the Messiah, will reign on the throne for 1,000 years, as God said. They'll have the land, right? So the land of Israel will be restored, and they will get to enjoy the promise that God has made. So all those promises in the Old Testament that have been made to Israel will be fulfilled in the millennium as Christ reigns on the throne. All the nations of the world are in subject to him, come to Jerusalem to give homage, to give their dues, to worship, and things like that. Other people would say, no, the millennium is only a symbol. It's symbolic. It's a metaphor. And there will not be a literal 1,000-year reign. So premillennialists then believe that the millennium will happen, and Jesus will return before the millennium starts. So pre-millennial. So you have pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, but then you have also pre-trib, pre-millennial, post-millennial, and amillennial. So it gets a little confusing. You start getting all these, and these things mix and match and mix together in different flavors and different ways. But a pre-millennial would say Jesus Christ comes back before the millennium, sets up his kingdom, and then reigns for 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years, Satan is let out of the pit, and he deceives the nations, and there's this big battle of Armageddon, and all the nations come and attack the Messiah in Jerusalem, and of course he slaughters them all. And there's a judgment, and then Satan is thrown into the lake of fire, and then the eternal state then begins. Eternity begins. That's a premillennial position. A amillennial position, all means not, there is no millennial. There is no literal millennial. They would just say it's a symbol for the ideal church. And we are living right now in the millennium. In other words, Christ is reigning spiritually over the world through the church, and we are now experiencing his rule in the world. A post-millennial. Post means Christ comes after the millennium. And so a post-millennial was very, very popular several hundred years ago. And they thought the church is going to spread the gospel to the whole world, and we're going to bring Christianity to every nation, and the world's going to get better and better and better until finally we conquer the whole world with the gospel, and Christ comes back and says, "Good job, guys," and he sets up the kingdom, right? He comes up and he actually sets up the eternal state after the church has created the millennium. Well, World War I and World War II kind of destroyed postmillennialism. It almost doesn't exist anymore. Up in the 1800s, I mean, the world was progressing, things were getting better and better. And then just the horror of World War I just devastated that hope. And after World War I was over, they said, okay, yeah, well, maybe we can pick up to again. And then we had World War II, and everyone said, the world is just getting horrible and worse and worse and worse. There's no hope. And so the church kind of lost that vision of conquering the world. Can you think of any parables, Mrs. O, that would kind of say that the things are going to get worse before Christ comes back rather than better?
Parable,
And Inky, can you think of any parables that say the world is going to get better and get better and better and better before the end of the world, before Christ comes back? So think about that. Jesus does tell parables about the wheat and the tares. Right? So the good wheat and the bad wheat are going to grow up together. The good wheat and the weeds. And so there will always be weeds. the parable of the fish, right? You brings in the big haul of fish, the clean fish and the unclean fish are separated at the end of time, the sheep and the goats. There will be sheep and there will be goats. Right? And so there seems to be that at the end of time, there will be unbelievers. And Jesus almost, some of the passages, things will go from bad to worse. And Jesus says, will there be any faith when the Son of Man returns? Even Paul says things are going to get worse and worse and worse, and deceivers are going to come. And so there seems to be parables and there seems to be teaching that indicate that the world is going to get really, really, really bad before Christ comes. Inky, can you think of anything that would say that the world gets better?
I think the only one where the world gets better is if Jesus comes back.
Well, there is the parable of the mustard seed,
Hmm.
where you put the little mustard seed and it grows up into a huge tree and kind of covers the whole world. So there are other parables that seem to indicate that the gospel is going to penetrate at least to the whole world. Jesus says the gospel is going to be preached to every nation, as Mrs. Ho pointed out. But does that necessarily mean it's going to be a better place? So even in the midst of intense persecution and attempts to destroy Christianity, it's still going to penetrate. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the world's going to accept it, right? But the gospel will be preached. So there is some kind of ambiguity there, which is right. Is it premillennial? Is it amillennial? Is it postmillennial? I tend to favor premillennial. I don't think that the church is going to usher in the millennium. And I don't believe that we are I don't believe in amillennium as either. So I do believe that there probably is going to be a literal 1,000-year where Christ reigns. I do believe there is a distinction between the church and Israel, though the church does replace Israel in many, many respects. I still think some of those promises that God made to Abraham, especially and to David, are going to be fulfilled. God is going to make sure that those things are carried out, and the millennium is a possibility for that. Next point is resurrection. How many resurrections are there? One, two, three? Yes, it all depends on your viewpoint,
There's
right?
there's no set number.
Well, I mean, there's debate. Some people believe that there's only one resurrection at the end of time. Everyone's resurrected at the same time. Others believe that believers will be resurrected first, and then they will be judged for their service and given their rewards. And then later there'll be a resurrection of unbelievers, and then they will be judged. Dispensationalists almost see 3 resurrections. The resurrections of believers at the rapture, all the believers who were killed up until when Jesus Christ returned are resurrected, and living believers are raptured up into heaven before the tribulation. And then when Christ comes back at the end of the tribulation, all those who died, all the believers who died during the tribulation are resurrected, and all unbelievers are then resurrected at the end when Christ comes. So that would be like 3 resurrections. So there's debate on that, though there will be a resurrection. So Inky, who resurrects us? Is it Jesus or is it God the Father?
So
It's a trick question.
it says resurrection is a physical one, but not a spiritual one.
Definitely a physical one, right? We would be bodily resurrected. That's important.
So I think it's mostly us. Like if we believe.
So
If we
those who
believe.
believe will be resurrected and will receive a spiritual body that will live for eternity. What about non-believers, Inky? Are they resurrected? What do you think, Mrs. O?
Sometime later, there'll be a second resurrection of unbelievers to face judgment.
And what happens to them after that?
They're going to face judgment, whether or not they did good work or not so good work.
So if they didn't believe in Jesus and they lived a bad life, what happens to them?
They can go to hell.
Ooh, so they're resurrected, receive a physical body, then that will spend eternity in hell. Yeah. And the Bible kind of talks about it's the Father who resurrects, but Jesus says, also I resurrect. And there's also a passage that says both the Father and the Son resurrect us on the last day. So the Father and the Son both work together in the resurrection. So where are dead people between now? If you die tonight, Inky, where do you go? Where do you go, Mrs. O? If you were to die tonight, where do you go?
Go to meet Jesus.
You go to meet Jesus. Okay, Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So you believe that when you die, you immediately go and you are in the presence of Christ. I think you're probably right. I believe that too. But not everyone believes that, right? Some people believe, no. Some people believe that we sleep. And we stay in the ground, and it's called soul sleep. There's nothing in the Bible that says that, but the Bible does talk about sleep, talks about death as sleep, and they say, well, you just kind of in the state of non-consciousness, and then when you're resurrected at the end of time, then you come back to life, and so you'll be 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, who knows, between your death and Christ coming back, you'll just be sleeping, right? You don't know. So that is kind of, but I think it's probably right that when we die, we immediately go to be present with what Paul says to die is much better, right? For me to live as Christ, to die is gain. For me to stay on is better for you, but for me to leave and depart from this world is much, much better. Because why? I'm going to depart, I'm going to be with the Lord. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, when I put off this earthly tent, then I get to put on my heavenly tent and be with Christ. So there is a sense that when believers now die, they go to be directly with the Lord. But what happened before Christ came? Where did people go when they died? And what happens to an unbeliever when they die? Do they go to be with Jesus? Well, you know of a couple of stories in the Bible, right? Remember Jesus talking about the rich man and Lazarus? So the rich man dies and goes to Hades, and Lazarus dies and goes to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man is tormented. Seems like he's in fire. He's thirsty. He wants water on his tongue, a drip of water to cool him. He wants Lazarus to go back and warn his brothers not to come to this place of torment. So it seems like when unbelievers die, they go to a place called Hades, or in the Old Testament, Sheol, which is a place of torment. Whereas believers, the righteous went to Abraham's bosom and were awaiting. And most people say that when Christ rose from the dead, he brought all of those righteous believers out of Abraham's bosom into his presence, awaiting then the resurrection of their bodies at the end of time. So it would seem like there is a bodiless existence between now and the bodily resurrection for believers and unbelievers who are now in a state of torment. Inky, I know you're hoping for a purgatory. Is there a purgatory?
No, there's no evidence in the Bible of purgatory.
No evidence for purgatory. So all those indulgences you bought are worthless.
Yeah, pretty
You were
much.
scammed. You were scammed. Yeah. There is no purgatory. It is appointed for man once to die, and then comes judgment. So judgment is, there's several judgments in the Bible. And history is moving towards the climax when the Father and the Son will judge people. Now, God is always judging people even today, but there will be a time when God is going to call all people before him and judge them based on what they have done. Mrs. O, when you stand before Jesus, what kind of judgment are you going to face?
Do you believe in Jesus? Is
Will
that,
you face condemnation?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Yeah, I hope, I believe I will not, right? Because there is no,
There is no condemnation for believers, right?
yes, Christ has taken our judgment for
Yes.
us. But we will all stand before the throne of Christ. What kind of judgment will that be then? Be the judgment of your works, yeah, of your
Yeah.
ministry.
Our deeds.
Or so you'll receive your crowns or your rewards for what you have done. So I know that you, Mrs. O, have sacrificed a lot for the sake of Christ. And he then will judge you and say, look at you, you sacrificed this, you lost this, you paid this price, therefore you will receive this reward. So the judgment for believers will be for rewards. What about unbelievers, Inky? What's going to happen when unbelievers stand before?
They go to the great white throne judgment.
And what happens in that judgment? How does God judge people?
Based on the works and based on what kinds of life they lived.
And it's going to be very objective, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I'll be subject. I don't like you. Hey, I lived a good life. That doesn't matter. I just don't like you. And oh, you're a rich guy. I really like you. Come on in. It's okay. But he was bad. Oh, it doesn't matter, right? No, it's going to be a fair judgment. Every deed, every thought, every motive, every action, every word is going to be evaluated objectively and righteously. Is there any hope for an unbeliever, Mrs. O, in that judgment?
Non-believers?
An unbeliever. Will any unbelievers enter heaven? After being judged at the great white throne? Yeah, only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life, right? Only those who believe. Because there is none righteous, no, not one. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So if you die without having believed in Jesus Christ, there's no hope. You did not live a good life. You did not live for God. You did not live for God's glory. So there is no hope. So the final judgment, Satan is going to be judged. He's going to be thrown into the lake of fire. All of his demons will be thrown into the lake of fire. And all those who sided with Satan by not believing in Jesus, by choosing to rebel against God and to follow the serpent, will also then experience the same judgment as Satan himself. So, Inky, are there different degrees of punishment?
Yeah. Based on
so.
our deeds. Yeah.
I think so. Mrs. O, are there different degrees of reward?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there's definitely different. Yeah, Paul even says, there's wood, hay, and stubble versus gold, silver, and precious stones. So you will receive a different reward based on how you served Christ and how sincere and faithful your service was. So, Mrs. O, is there really a hell?
Of course, yes,
People don't want to hear that.
I know.
Is it really a place of fire, Inky?
Yeah,
It's just not metaphorical. It's not metaphorical fire.
no, everlasting fire.
Everlasting fire. Now, some people say, well, hell means that people are actually destroyed, they're burned up. Do you believe in annihilationism, Mrs. O? Where unbelievers are annihilated, totally wiped out of existence? Or do you
No.
believe in eternal suffering that goes on and on and on forever?
That's what I heard from the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think any creature, any being that God has created will ever go out of existence. So either it spends eternity in God's presence or it spends eternity away from God's presence. Hell's also described as a place of outer darkness, eternal torture, and punishment. C.S. Lewis, I like this quote: hell is nothing but yourself for eternity. Hell is nothing but yourself for all eternity. What do you think of that quote, Mrs. O? I think he's being hyperbolic. I think he's, obviously hell's more than that, but
Well, that seems to me it emphasizes human as a spiritual being. Spiritual things never disappear, it just forever.
but you're alone. You have no contact with any other being. Can you imagine being in isolation, solitary confinement for eternity? Most people go insane if they're put in solitary confinement for any length of time. Is that right, Inky?
Yeah,
Yeah. Can you imagine spending eternity in solitary confinement?
that's harsh.
That's harsh. Yeah. Even in this world, we enjoy the benefits of God's grace and even God's presence in some respect. But in hell, there will be no presence of God. There will be no grace. There will be nothing. Right? People don't realize how much of God's goodness they're experiencing now. They will experience zero goodness of God for eternity. And then you just have to live with your regrets and your sin for eternity. Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought. Even if Inky, even if there is no literal fire, I still think that's a pretty bad place. Oh,
Yeah.
I don't believe that, I don't believe there's a literal fire. Okay, that's fine. I'll grant you that, but this is still just as bad. Right. So hell is an essential corollary to God's holiness. Because God is totally holy and without sin, he must punish sin and remove it completely from his presence. So if we are to live forever in God's presence, then all sin, including the sin within us, needs to be removed. And those who just say, look, I don't want to give up my sin, I want to hold on to it, then God has to put them in a place separate from himself. Right? He has to remove it from his presence. Hell is described as eternal in the same way that eternal life is described as eternal. And often in parallel, eternal life and eternal destruction. So you can't say, well, eternal destruction is annihilation and you're going to just disappear. But that doesn't make sense then. If eternal life, what does that mean then? Right, so eternal life goes on forever. That probably means then eternal judgment goes on forever. Well, heaven then is the final destination for the righteous, but it's best described as where God is and where Christ is. And I think a lot of people, when they think about heaven, they think about a Christless heaven. Where I'm gonna be happy and I'm gonna do all the things that I want, and I'm gonna be, but there's no thought of Christ. Yeah, that's not heaven. Heaven is where Christ is. Heaven is where we have eternal communion with Christ. Everything's going to be made new. God's kingdom will be established. God will reign in holiness and righteousness forever. And this is our hope. And it surpasses our wildest imagination. Well, anything else you want to say before I conclude?